Restoring men in history. Which reigns supreme, the Constitution or the judges? Article 6, Clause 2 of the Constitution states this: this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. So first, as I pointed out, key words in this are what? And I said this years ago at the men's conference. Shall be made in pursuance. Those are key words. Why? Because it's not supreme if Congress just passes some unconstitutional act that they have no enumerated power for. That would not make it supreme, right? Now notice it does not say judicial supremacy, constitutional supremacy. And that's what we're going to get into today. Constitutional supremacy, not judicial supremacy. T.J. Martinelli at the 10th Amendment Center wrote a piece that I liked. And here's the first part of it. And it's funny, I just talked about this last night in the men's group, which is the myth of Andrew Jackson and Marshall. President Andrew Jackson allegedly remarked, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Whether it happened or not doesn't matter. The point is constitutional authority, who has it? And here's the question. Is the president required to enforce U.S. Supreme Court opinions? I think this is important for today. By the way, it doesn't matter if you're Democrat, Republican, or whatever you are, it's about the Constitution. So there's a great essay, which I read, and it's in here. The President and the Myth of Judicial Supremacy. Michael Stokes Paulson argues the resounding answer is no. Quote, nearly everyone, it seems, defends at least some version of the view that the federal judiciary's final judgment in cases or controversies actually decided by the courts are conclusive and binding of the other branches of the national government and on the state government actors, he writes. Now, there's people that always talk about Marbury Madison. Hopefully we'll come back and do the whole case of Marbury Madison. I think it's an important one. But he talks about that. Paulson points out that Marbury stands for the proposition of constitutional supremacy, not judicial supremacy. And I agree with that. I've read that case. And the independence of each of the branches of the national government in the exercise of the duty to what? Adhere faithfully to what? The Constitution. Quote, a faithful misinterpretation of the Constitution is not binding on another branch of government. He writes further, each actor is oath-bound to enforce the Constitution and not the faithless departures from it by other governmental actors. By the way, this has been a large issue for America through history. Look at the federal government, how it's grown in size and power, gone beyond their enumerated powers. This is a real problem and issue. Those branches should have held it in check. All three branches and the states should have held the federal government and kept them to their enumerated powers. They did not. We've gone way beyond it. What does it amounted to? Look at the debt. Look at the deficits. Look at the areas where the federal government is involved in your life, where they had no enumerated power. So he goes on. He cites Federalist number 78, where Alexander Hamilton states SCOTUS may truly be said to have neither force nor will. It's a good paper, 78. But merely judgment, and must ultimately depend upon the aid of the executive arm, even for the efficacy of its judgments. Pretty clear, right? That's a clear-cut argument for what? Constitution, rather than judiciary, right? James Madison wrote in Federalist 49, from among the three branches, none of them, it is evident, can pretend to an exclusive or superior right of settling the boundaries between their respective powers. Paulson writes that is as categorical as a rejection of one branch interpretive supremacy and as unequivocal as an embrace of interpretive coordinacy as it is possible to imagine. It entails a rejection of judicial supremacy, right? Every bit as much as a rejection of congressional supremacy or executive supremacy in constitutional interpretation. We don't want any of the three branches dominating, right? We want all of them protecting and defending the Constitution because they took an oath to uphold it. For what? For your liberty. To protect your liberty. Yet he observes that nearly everyone, it seems, defends at least some version of the new view that the federal judiciary's final judgments in cases or controversies actually decided by the courts are conclusive and binding on the other branches of the national government and on state government actors. Now, if you go through the Federalist Papers, you'll see how important separation of powers were to them. We just did Federalist 51. And in that paper, what does he reiterate over and over? That's James Madison. Separation of powers, checks and balances. So each branch must defend their constitutional sphere, their powers, and the Constitution. At the same time, quote, nearly everyone, it seems, defends at least some limited version of the rather different proposition in considerable tension with the first, that the other branches possess a sphere of autonomy and independence in constitutional interpretation. Again, going back to Federalist 51 and the other Federalist Papers, this was very important to them. They wanted those checks and balances and the separation of powers. They wanted right ambition must be made to counteract ambition, he says in Federalist 51. Why? To protect their constitutional spheres. Why? For your liberty. Because what is the role of government? To secure those rights, not add to their powers, not enlarge themselves, which they've been doing. That is, Congress, the president, and perhaps others possess a co-equal prerogative of constitutional interpretation. The problem is those two views are contradictory. Either one must be right, or the other. Both cannot be correct. Paulson writes that to argue for judicial supremacy is to undermine the very notion of, we love this one coming up, federalism's equal branches of government. Now, federalism is very important to your freedom. Compound republic, it divided the powers between the states and the federal government. Federalism. Most of the domestic powers, almost all, were reserved to the states and the people. Federal government got few limited specific powers, Federalist 45. So federalism, very important, and he goes on to quote this, and we need federalism for your liberty, to protect it, also to give you choices, freedom, you can move with your feet. Quote, if the executive branch must honor and enforce court judgments, then it has no genuine sphere of interpreted autonomy. We know that wasn't meant to be the case. You can go all the way through the Federalist Papers and the ratification debates. The premises of constitutional supremacy and separation of powers vested in independent, coordinate, co-equal branches of government support the former conclusion. True. And you can go back to Federalist 51 and see all the words of Madison we've got in a video. Complete coordinacy. As disturbing as it might seem in some of its applications and as unsettling as it might be for current practice, let's talk. And he goes in, we got a video on this too, the Sedition Act. He says the Notorious Alien and Sedition Act. We did a video on the Sedition Act because it's so horrific. Cutting off what? What did the Sedition Act do? Infringed on the First Amendment. Infringed on your ability to say, write, and think what you wanted in journalists. Actually threw people in jail, the Sedition Act. It was a disaster. John Adams signed on to it. Paulson possesses a hypothetical situation. What if a new version of that legislation were to be passed by Congress? Think about it. What if it were? Is the described statute unconstitutional, he asks. He poses this point. The point is that the statute is objectively, incontrovertibly unconstitutional. And he hopes that everyone would agree with that. Does everybody agree? So going on in further discussion, we start with that agreement. He writes that the correct constitutional response by the president to any such law would be to veto it or refuse and veto it and refuse to enforce it. Whether the courts have spoken or not, whether the courts have upheld the act's provision, and everything's not going to make it to the Supreme Court. They're not going to take some cases. And whether the matter at hand involves the judgment in the specific case decided or a different factually indistinguishable one. Consequently, it is not only your power, but also your duty to carry out the provisions of this flagrantly unconstitutional act. So each branch has a duty to protect and defend the Constitution from any branch going beyond their power, right? And especially you've got to check the judiciary, and you've got to check the Congress, and you got to check the president, the executive branch. You got to check all the branches. But right now we're dealing with the judiciary, and they've gone way beyond their powers. So, irrespective of what the judiciary said, in addition to Hamilton and Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and we know Thomas Jefferson, there are many quotes we could pull from Thomas Jefferson on the judiciary. We know he saw lots of problems in the judiciary in regards to tyranny. Thomas Jefferson argued for constitutional supremacy. In a letter to Abigail Adams, why would he write her? Because John Adams signed off on the Sedition Act and the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Federalists used that. Regarding the Alien and Sedition Act, he wrote, You seem to think it devolved on the judges to decide on the validity of the sedition law. Sedition law was just horrific. But nothing in the Constitution has given them a right to decide for the executive more than to the executive to decide for them, right? Separation of powers, checks and balances, departments, independent. Both magistrates are equally independent in the sphere of action assigned to them. The judges, believing the law constitutional, had a right to pass a sentence of fine and imprisonment because the power was placed in their hands by the Constitution. But the executive, believing the law to be unconstitutional, was bound to remit the execution of it. Because that power has been confided to them by what? The Constitution. And they got to protect the Constitution for your liberty. That instrument meant that its coordinate branches should be checks on each other. But the opinion which gives to the judges the right to decide what laws are constitutional and what not only for themselves in their own sphere of action, but for the legislature and executive also in their spheres, would make the judiciary a despotic branch. Pretty strong words from Jefferson. Going on, ironically, one of the more recent defenses of constitutional supremacy has come from SCOTUS itself in the form of a dissenting opinion by Scalia in the 2015 Obergefell v. Hodges opinion. Again, government going beyond their powers. Federalist 78 said this: an appeal to the weakness of the judiciary. If you remember 78, he talks about weakness of the judiciary, not a threat to your liberty. And he goes through that big piece in 78, the weakest branch, noting the constitutional power of the other branches of government to counteract judicial decisions that abuse the court's proper constitutional authority. Paulson writes. Paulson concludes that the president's independent province of constitutional interpretation extends in principle to the exercise even of the power not to execute judicial judgments in specific cases. Did you hear that? Where the court's decision is contrary to what? Our beloved Constitution or other controlling law. So, federalism's important. Separation of powers is important. The founders made that clear in the Federalist Papers. To your liberty. Constitutional supremacy over judicial supremacy. And I'll end with something Jefferson wrote to William Charles Jarvis in 1820. To consider the judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions, a very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. Our judges are as honest as other men, and not more so. They have, with others, the same passions for party, for power, and the privileges of their corps. Their maxim is, and I may mispronounce this, boni judicius est appellare jurisdictionem. What does it mean? It means it is the part of a judge to extend his jurisdiction, and they certainly have done that. The judicial branch has extended their powers at your expense, at the expense of the states and the people. Going on. And their power the more dangerous as they are in office for life and not responsible as the other functionaries are to the elective control. The Constitution has erected no such single tribunal, knowing that to whatever hands confine it with the corruptions of time and party, its members would become despots. It has more wisely made all the departments co-equal and co-sovereign within themselves. Strong words from Thomas Jefferson on the judicial branch. So what was Thomas Jefferson concerned with? Tyranny, oligarchy. One branch gaining too much power. He was very worried about the judicial branch gaining too much power, and as we've seen, they do have too much power. It was meant to be the weakest branch. Hamilton even said it, and he was the biggest national government guy. He was afraid. They had already faced a king. They didn't want another king. They didn't want a tyrant. They didn't want a dictator. They didn't want a big parliament again. They were for limited government and liberty.